Okay, welcome. This is SAT Worksheet 101. This 101 concept is at the heart of both the grammar section of the SAT, which is section 2 and has 44 problems, and the grammar section of the ACT, which is section 1 and has 75 problems. A little over 60% of the problems on both tests on the grammar section test on just pure knowledge of grammar and punctuation. The other 40% tend to test on content, topic, sentences, things like that. But for the grammar side of things, this concept 101, this idea of independent clauses and how to combine them and being able to distinguish between an independent and a dependent clause, this is the nucleus. This is the foundation. It's essential for both tests. And it's also something that's not explicitly taught in school, or a lot of times maybe it's taught at a younger age, like 11, 12, 13, but never really reviewed. So anyway, let's just dive right in. I'm going to give a sentence, and I want you to determine whether it's correct or incorrect, and ideas as to why or why not it may be correct or incorrect. So I'm just going to keep it simple. I'm going to say, John hit the ball. John hit the ball, comma, he ran to first base. And if you want, pause the video and take a moment to think about whether this is correct or incorrect. John hit the ball, he ran to first base. I'm going to keep on talking. So if you want to pause, now is your chance. So anyway, this comes up a lot. I guarantee you'll see something just like this on either the ACT or the SAT, and maybe even a few of them. This is what's called a comma splice. It is entirely incorrect, and it's incorrect 100% of the time. What is wrong with it? Well, essentially, you have two full sentences, and you're trying to combine them with just a comma, and you can't do it. More specifically, you actually have what are called two independent clauses. I'm going to write IC for independent clause. And there are only 4 proper ways to combine two independent clauses, and you're going to want to need to know all 4. And we'll get into that in just a second. But before we get into that, let's actually talk about what a clause is and the difference between a clause and a phrase. So let's map this out real quickly. So a clause is the essential DNA of any sentence. A clause has to have a subject and a verb. If it doesn't have a subject and a verb, it is not a clause. In order to be an independent clause, you need to have a subject, a verb, and you need to complete the idea. So an example of an IC or independent clause would be something as simple as Beth spoke. We have a subject, we have a verb, we've completed our idea. So Beth spoke, subject, verb, complete idea, that's an independent clause. An example of a dependent clause, well, a dependent clause will still have a subject and a verb, but the difference with a dependent clause is it won't be able to stand alone as a sentence. You can't put a full stop after it. So an example of that would be if we just put the word although before Beth. Although Beth spoke, as you can see, we haven't really finished our idea. So if you're ever going to use a full stop, you need to have an independent clause somewhere. Every sentence has to have an independent clause at some point to anchor it down. There's also something called a phrase. So sentences are made up of clauses and phrases. A phrase is just a string of words that go together, but it lacks both the subject and the verb. So an example of a phrase could be the boy by the house. By the house is a prepositional phrase that modifies the boy, but that is a string of words that goes together. We're lacking a verb though. So anyway, the test expects you to be able to identify when you have an independent clause and to know what to do with it. In the case of this comma splice, we have John hit the ball, subject, verb, complete idea. He ran to first base. He is your subject. Ran is your verb, complete idea. We cannot combine the two with just a comma. It sounds okay because we're pausing as if there's a full stop there. It is not okay. So you'll see on this worksheet, we define independent, dependent clause. You can look at all of this later, but essentially I'll hit everything that's here. But let's take a look at what we can do with the comma splice. So we have a brand new comma splice right here, and it's Layla drove her car into London. That's an independent clause. She could not find parking. Another independent clause, a subject, a verb, and a complete idea. So we have a comma splice. This is wrong. There are only 4 options you can do when you have 2 independent clauses, if you want to keep them as such. Option 1 is you put a full stop between the 2. Option 2 is you use a semicolon. If you're curious what a semicolon does, a semicolon holds up 2 independent clauses. That's exactly its job. In fact, there's really no difference between using the semicolon or the period in the eyes of the test, because they both hold up 2 independent clauses. For your own information, the semicolon closely links the 2 together. It signals that whatever follows connects back to the first part, where a period, anything can come next. But the test won't get that granular. The one other use of semicolons, and you can look this up if you're really curious, is 1 out of maybe 50 times, and very rarely on the test, I've seen it maybe 3 times, you'll use semicolons for a list that already has commas. So if you're curious about that, Google semicolons list with commas. But anyway, the other things we can do to help with these 2 independent clauses is we can use a comma, but what follows it has to be one of 7 words. It has to be one of our fanboys is the acronym, and it stands for and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. You'll see all that in a second, so don't think you need to have that memorized right now. I'm going to show you a chart with that. But you will need to have those 7 coordinating conjunctions or fanboys down for the test. And I'll elaborate on that too. Anyway, the last thing you could do is you could put a colon here. A colon is very unique in that a colon does not need to be followed by an independent clause. You need to have an independent clause out in front of the colon, but you don't need to follow the colon with an independent clause. You could do a list, 1 word, bunch of different things work with a colon. My brother has an extraordinary talent, independent clause. He can juggle, independent clause. So you can use 2 independent clauses with a colon, but you could also just follow with 1 word. You always have to have an independent clause out front. These other 3, though, you have to have an independent clause on both sides. So now that we have a sense of what an independent clause is, and we have a sense of how a semicolon works, let's dive deeper into what the coordinating conjunctions are, and then words that can kind of serve as imposters and be a little tricky on the test. So I'm going to zoom out just a tad. So you'll need to be able to distinguish between coordinating conjunctions, aka the fanboys, and conjunctive adverbs. Coordinating conjunctions, it's just these 7 words: for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. Why are these words so special? Well, a coordinating conjunction with a comma can hold up 2 independent clauses. An example of this is Gerald needed petroleum, independent clause, comma, so, from our list, so he pulled over at the next station. That is entirely acceptable. Here's where it gets interesting. This would not work if I said Gerald needed petroleum and I changed the so to a thus. Thus he pulled over at the next station. That would not work. That would actually be a comma splice again. So with the so, we're okay. We're able to hold up 2 independent clauses with just a comma. With any run-of-the-mill transition word, that's not a coordinating conjunction. It's still a comma splice. And what I mean by run-of-the-mill transition words, I mean conjunctive adverbs. So these conjunctive adverbs, I mean pretty much any transition you can think of. There's a few here. However, nonetheless, for example, these conjunctive adverbs have 0 powers. Okay, they help smooth the transition between 2 parts of a sentence, but other than that, they don't do anything with independent clauses. So something you'll see that's entirely wrong is Linda loves fast food. However, she does not like drive-throughs. So this is a comma splice. With however, we're not holding up 2 independent clauses. It would work if we said Linda loves fast food and we used but Linda loves fast food, comma, but she does not like drive-throughs. That's okay. We have 2 independent clauses, but we're connecting them by a comma but. But if we insist on using the conjunctive adverb and not changing it to a but or a yet, right? But or yet. If we don't do that, then we have to put a semicolon in front of however. If however is going to hold up two independent clauses, it's actually going to be the semicolon that does the work. Okay, so that's a conjunctive adverb. The one other transition word that you have to be familiar with is a subordinating conjunction. What does a subordinating conjunction do? Well, subordinating conjunction takes an independent clause and it turns it into a dependent clause. How so? Well, if we look at this, or let's look at this sentence, sorry. If we look at this one all the way to the right, Remus is violent, he cannot have scissors. That's a comma splice. Remus is violent is an independent clause, he cannot have scissors is an independent clause. We can't connect those two with just a comma. However, if I put a subordinating conjunction like because out front, the first part turns into a dependent clause. If you remember when I said Sarah spoke and then although Sarah spoke at the beginning, although Sarah spoke was a dependent clause. Why? Because of the subordinating conjunction although. So if a sentence starts with a subordinating conjunction, that first part is a dependent clause and we're okay with just a comma. We don't have a comma splice. So a quick recap before we get into a few practice problems is you need to be able to define when you have an independent clause. You need to know what your 7 coordinating conjunctions are and how they can combine two independent clauses with just a comma, or your fanboys. You need to know how a semicolon works, just like a full stop, more or less. And you need to know how a colon works. And there's more on colons on worksheet 102. So anyway, let's try a few problems and see how much of this has stuck so far. By the way, this combining sentences bit, we're not going to cover in this video because it's something that is specific to the SAT. It does not come up on the ACT. But a lot of what we have talked about with independent clauses will help with the combining sentences on the second half of this worksheet. Anyway, let's look at problem number 3. And I'll make this a little bigger. And I'll give you a moment to think about it. Feel free to pause the video when I'm done reading and see if you can get the answer. So we have each year, many species of shorebirds migrate from locations in the southern hemisphere to their breeding grounds in the Arctic. So that is definitely an independent clause. And we know we're being tested on independent clauses because we have a full stop, we have 2 semicolons. So let's see the second half of this. A journey of thousands of kilometers that requires frequent stops to fuel up. So this is what's called an appositive. It's just a phrase. So we do not have 2 independent clauses. Knowing that, this problem becomes actually really easy. It cannot be C, because semicolon means we need to have 2 independent clauses. It cannot be D, and it also cannot be A with the full stop. So this one is going to be B. Let's do one more problem. I think a good one will be let's do number 9. So number 9 says some take a scientific approach. That's an independent clause. Some is your subject. So we have some take a scientific approach. Then we have consulting carefully screened focus groups to help them decide which voice best suits their population. So the key thing here is you have to decide whether or not that's an independent clause. If that's an independent clause, we have a comma splice, and it's not A. And we need to go in the direction of maybe using a semicolon. That said, if the second part's not an independent clause, A is actually the right answer. So interestingly enough, the second half is just a long phrase. It's called a participle phrase. You have an ing, which is not a verb, it's a descriptor, and we're lacking a subject. So as a result, this is going to be A. B doesn't work because we don't have 2 independent clauses. D doesn't work because we don't have 2 independent clauses. And C, we add in they consult, which makes the second half an independent clause if you read it. They consult carefully screened focus groups. But with just a comma, C is, interestingly enough, a comma splice. Okay. One final problem, one bonus problem. We'll do number 10. The messages themselves may be quite perfunctory and provide little scope for dramatic interpretation. That is an independent clause. We have a subject, a verb, and we complete the idea. Semicolon, but immediately if you have a semicolon with one of your fanboys or coordinating conjunctions, it's automatically wrong. Fanboys only work with commas. They don't work with semicolons. If you're going to use a semicolon, you'd have a word like however or nonetheless, a conjunctive adverb. So A is already gone. But let's look at this. But they still must be read with just the right intonation and emphasis. So they still must be read with just the right intonation and emphasis. That is an independent clause. So we know not to combine a semicolon and a fanboy, but a comma with a fanboy to hold up two independent clauses is exactly what we want. We know it's not D for the same reason it's not A. And hopefully you know why C is not right. I'll take a second to read it, and I want you to think why C is not right. The messages themselves may be quite perfunctory and provide little scope for dramatic interpretation, comma, however, so we have an independent clause before the however. After the however, we have however, they still must be read with just the right intonation and emphasis. So we have an independent clause after the comma and the however. Hopefully what you're shouting at your screen right now is a comma and with however, a conjunctive adverb is a comma splice. However does not have the power that but does. C would be correct if it was semicolon, however, comma. Then we'd be allowed to hold up the two independent clauses. Okay, I hope this video is helpful. Good luck with the worksheet. And as you know, you have access to the other videos for the other worksheets as well. So feel free to visit any of these videos anytime you need them.